that part. So, hello, good afternoon. My name is Christina Clark O'Karmas. Pronouns are she, her. And I am the executive director at the Alabama Campaign for Adolescent Sexual Health. Happy New Year to you all. Thanks for being on our first webinar of 2024. I think we have a great offering for you today with our guest speaker, Camille Lewis. And just want to let anybody know who is, maybe this is your first time here, just let you know a little bit about our organization. We are the only organization in Alabama whose sole focus is on expanding comprehensive sex education in the state, a state that is sorely lacking in quality evidence-based sex ed. And so myself, Megan Lyle, who's also on the call today, and then one other staff person, Brittany Winston, are charged with advancing sex ed in Alabama. We are a 501c3 nonprofit based, well, we're kind of based out of where we all live because we are a fully remote organization, but we do work statewide. I'm located in Montgomery, Megan's in Tuscaloosa, our other staff person is in Huntsville. So kind of the length of the state. And we do these monthly webinar offerings as a way to give back. We started this back during the pandemic, of course, when virtual was the only way we could reach anyone. And it was very popular to bring in like, these guest speakers and to learn about things that are related to adolescent sexual health, but maybe you don't have an opportunity to get them as part of your regular professional development. So that's why we're here to offer it for free. And we hope it's valuable to you as well. And so we do these once a month, typically on the second Tuesday of the month. Sometimes that varies depending on the speaker and yeah, so that's the gist of what we do. I'm going to pass it over to Megan to introduce our guest speaker now. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Lyle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the health educator at the Alabama Campaign. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially to Camille for presenting with us today. So today we've invited licensed marriage and family therapist Camille Lewis. Camille will give a talk titled Pleasure as Resistance, Race, Sexuality, and Intersectionality in Sex Therapy. Camille is, like I said, a licensed marriage and family therapist, chief people officer at the Expansive Group, and co-host of the podcast Safe Word. Camille is a sex therapist whose work explores intersectionality, intersectional identity, particularly race, sexuality, and gender, pleasure, and decolonizing mental health. Camille centers the unique experiences of her clients and prioritizes the need for interconnectedness and authenticity. She's a lecturer, teacher, and facilitator who is passionate about expansive, inclusive curiosity and exploration. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'll pass it over to you, not to take any more time. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lengthy intro. Thank you. Welcome everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm recovering from a little cold situation, so if I need to mute to cough or blow my nose and be gross, please bear with me. And we will get started. I have some slides prepared, and I'll also just be engaging in dialogue with you all. And I really encourage you to ask questions along the way. I will ask questions, so any participation is greatly appreciated, and we will just kind of take it from there. Okay, now I'm going to do the screen share. Okay, give me just 1 second. Perfect. Oop. I will a little bigger. There we go. Okay, so I am going to be talking about pleasure today. And especially as I consider it in an act of resistance, as we look at what oppression and systems of oppression do to especially marginalized and oppressed people. Pardon me already. So a little bit about me is I am a sex therapist at the Expansive Group. And a big part of my practice is pleasure focused, it's intersectional, it's relational, it's trauma informed, anti oppressive, client centered, and somatic. Somatic just means that I also incorporate the body. So I do a lot of body based work and interventions. So not just focusing on kind of like the cerebral processes of mental health, but also what happens in your body, which I find to be really important. It's really important for me to practice from an intersectional lens. I am a Black woman, I'm a bisexual woman, and so it feels important for there to be authenticity in my practice. I find that it helps a lot of my clients also experience authenticity in themselves. Therapy is a very vulnerable experience, and so I think we ask a lot of our clients when they show up and ask a lot for them to share. And so I also like to kind of model some authenticity. When I say it's relational, it is really based on the relationship. So less about kind of a psychoanalytical perspective and more about the relationship that I develop with my clients. It's trauma informed in that I really practice meeting everybody where they are. So it's very consent based and modeling what that looks like. So I think that that is also very important to my practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where this came from and why it matters. So when I think about resistance and the fullness of who I am and not being recognized from a more systemic practice, it felt really important. Like I think that it felt important for me just as a student growing up and figuring out like what voices were valued in the classroom and what voices weren't, when there was kind of punishment doled out in the education system and when there wasn't. So resistance has been a really big part of my life. And I did my senior thesis about resistance in the educational sphere and what it looks like in high school classrooms. So it really is important for me to kind of conceptualize of ways that groups that are oppressed can still maintain their sense of identity and their sense of self in places and structures that don't want them to. This also came from the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, who's the author of Pleasure Activism, Joy Prioritizing Yourself. And it's a great book if anybody wants to look into it. Also came from Liberation Psychology, which is kind of a more indigenous and ancestral communal approach to psychotherapy, and anti-oppressive practice, which I kind of touched on, and developing safety. So I've really learned how important it is to develop a safe practice and for people to feel safe in the work. Okay. So we'll dive in now to what pleasure is. So if you all feel comfortable, I would love to hear from some of you about like what you think pleasure is. If you want to define it, if you want to give me examples, if somebody were to ask you what is pleasure, what would you say? There's no wrong answer. It could be anything.
I'll just read what was said in the chat. Something that gives you joy,
Yeah.
something that makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for doing that because I can't see it.
Hmm.
Anything else?
Positive physiological or emotional response can be physical or emotional.
Yeah, absolutely. I have some pictures here. And I think that it's expanding. I think a lot of what you all said also doesn't really touch on sexual pleasure, which is also great because pleasure is really expansive, right? Like you can get pleasure when you eat something really delicious. You can get pleasure when you're like in your bed at the end of a long day, pleasure from a friend and having a really wonderful connected conversation, listening to music, being outside, resting, laughing. There's so many different examples of what pleasure can look like. And I think that we focus so much on what is diagnosable, what's problematic, what's scary, what's going wrong. We really kind of forget that there are places to connect with ourselves, which is really at the core of pleasure. It's like when you feel good, when you feel joy, when you feel curious, when you feel heard. So those are kind of some of the tenets of pleasure that I wanted to touch on. I also have some definitions. So pleasure as a noun is a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. An adjective is used or intended for entertainment rather than business, which I think is really interesting of kind of this dichotomous positioning of if you're feeling pleasure, you're not working. And so how void is work of pleasure? It's really interesting. And as a verb is to give sexual enjoyment or satisfaction to. Um, I guess I'm wondering from this definition or these definitions, what's missing or what might you change, if anything?
I'll throw one in there because I've gotten old and it's something that feels good you don't feel bad about later.
That's really good. That's really great. So I think that there's like the guilty pleasure, right? Which is this really interesting way to talk about something when it's like we should feel shame about feeling good. So that point that you just brought up about like something you feel good about that you don't feel bad about later. So really reducing that guilt and shame and just being like, this just feels good, period, in the sentence. Yeah, I like that. Anybody else?
One that I didn't read from the chat from Kylan, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who said a human right, something that brings bliss or gives your life meaning.
I love that. Yeah, it is a human right. And I think that like feeling that we feel entitled to pleasure is something that is kind of a novel concept because we really feel like we have to earn it and we have to work for it. We have to justify it. We have to make sure that it makes sense to us and other people when we do something for ourselves or centered on ourselves and our own joy. So I'm definitely with you in that it is a human right and just makes us feel good. Yes. How often do we get to do that lately, you know? Not very often. Okay, so moving on. So similarly, I'd love to hear from you all about resistance. So resistance is categorized as the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument, armed or violent opposition, the ability not to be affected by something, especially adversely. So when we look at resistance, the rise of the word resistance actually came around in the 1960s with the rise of civil rights movements and sexual liberation movements. And so this word really became popularized at a time when it was categorized as this kind of, it was categorized as an armed or violent opposition is what I would say. And I think that when it says the ability not to be affected by something, I feel like that's kind of an unreasonable ask because how can you not be affected by things that feel painful or hurtful or make you feel afraid in your own body? And I think that when we prioritize pleasure, we gain an access to more neutrality. So rather than not being affected by something at all, we kind of can have these pockets of pleasure that help us feel more neutral about maybe the systems of oppression that we do face. And it pokes holes into that framework of oppression. But I guess similarly here, I would love to hear what you think is missing or what you would change from this definition. Or maybe what you think of when you think of resistance.
Again, from the chat, we have Keaton saying reinforcing and or asserting individual and collective boundaries.
I like that. definitely have to have boundaries when you're resisting something that you've been told is the only way to do something, right? And now you're looking at different ways to approach the same thing and having boundaries and doing that. I like that you said individually and collectively.
Mhm. From Mary Beth, nonviolent resistance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mary Beth, what would nonviolent resistance look like if you wouldn't mind expanding?
Sure, sorry, I'm on my treadmill, so I had to be multitasking here. I just think about the written word can be a form of resistance, and that can be non-physical violence, right? Like there could be resistance or violent words, but it's not physically going to hurt someone. So that's what I think about in like non-violent resistance, like
Yeah.
the written word or spoken word, just like not harming somebody. Because I think of like the second bullet of like armed or violent opposition,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like that's what I was thinking about.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts?
From Brianna, an inoculation that increases resilience.
Ooh, say more if you don't mind. You can type it.
I can talk. I think it's kind of to your point, right? That resistance is not something that is going to make you not feel things, but it's the
Mhm.
ability to become like robust against it. Like I think of in some ways like a vaccine, right? Like it's not that you're not going to have those things happen to you, but you now have a higher amount of skills and resources to attack or approach a situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I love using like resilience there of, yeah, like building up antibodies if you're thinking about a vaccine and what your reserves and your resources look like so that you maybe don't feel as depleted as quickly. So not to not be affected by something, but to feel more prepared and to feel like you have more resources when you are dealing with something. That's great. And definitely we've seen this historically, right? We see this with the rise of like Black liberation, sexual liberation, and even AIDS awareness in the 80s of what it was like to come against these dominant structures that were telling you, no, you don't deserve rights, the suffrage movement and voting and things of that nature, and what it is like to kind of remain steadfast in like your desire to experience just natural human rights that dominant folks get access to. So I really just love this quote from Adrienne Marie Brown that says, "Our radical imagination is a tool for decolonization, for reclaiming our right to shape our lived reality." So I would love to hear any reactions that you might have from this, especially maybe as it pertains to a radical imagination. And to touch on somebody's earlier point that they said, like reclaiming our right, like a natural given right to pleasure.
This isn't from the chat, but it's just one thought that I had.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe what was missing from the resistance slide that this kind of captures is like the idea of like building like a more just or liberated future as a part of resistance, like not just resisting the structures that be, but creating the structures we want to see, that will like allow us to feel more pleasure, be more connected to each other, that kind of thing.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like of like what the imagination is capable of and how to conceive of a reality that feels like a departure from what we've experienced and not just survival. There's a hand raised.
I'm just thinking about so I do a lot of sex education in my work as a sure most people on this call do. And there have been conversations around like the orgasm gap, right? And I feel like I work specifically more with college students, and I feel like that is like the hot topic is like, oh, female orgasm, it matters, like, oh
Yep.
yeah, blah, blah, blah. And I think that part of that misses the mark, where I don't necessarily want students to like have a spreadsheet where they're able to say like, I got as many orgasms as my partner, right?
Right.
I want us to be able to imagine like, well, what is pleasure for us?
Yeah.
And pleasure may not be orgasm. Like there is a lot that goes on in sex that is joyful and fun and we cannot have regrets about, right? And so I think this piece of imagination really hits that for me, of wanting people to be able to think of like an entirely new paradigm for what equals good sex, rather than just trying to like equalize orgasms.
That's a really great point, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but I think that it's wonderful that you brought it up in like identifying the orgasm gap as a place to start from what happens in a sexual dynamic. But I think that there's a few things there, right? Like it's very, very heteronormative to talk about the orgasm gap. And it also is, like you said, I feel like when we talk about orgasm, we really forget about lots of different groups of people. We forget about ability levels. You know, as a therapist, I've worked with a lot of women and vulva owners who have never experienced orgasm. And there are different types of ways that people can engage in sex, that it can be pleasurable and gratifying. That doesn't have to just mean kind of that stereotypical old Masters and Johnson, you know, excitement plateau orgasm. Forgot the fourth one, whatever, type of sex, and like being really creative and being really imaginative and what feels good. And I think that that is a really wonderful point. And yeah, not just tally marking, like, did I come as much as you did? And how did we make that like equal, is being more curious in relationship. So great point. I think there were two more hands.
Yeah, I also touching on that as well as what I was thinking. I mean, I think imagining and being present in our bodies and feeling things and being pleasure focused is radical to begin with.
For sure.
The orgasm gap, focusing on that is focusing on outcomes, which is what we're conditioned to focus on to begin with. But to actually think like, oh, how do I feel in this moment? How does my body feel in this moment? If I could imagine a perfect, ideal experience for me, what would that feel like? I think that is radical to begin with. It's also making me think of the book Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey, who does the NAP ministry as well. But
Yep.
just the concept of how radical it is to actually get in touch with ourselves in the present to begin with. And that's actively fighting against thinking just of outcomes.
Absolutely. And I think that, like, you know, the idea that we have choice or autonomy or influence is taken away by these systems of oppression. And so when you're thinking about like just like having a radical experience, is being curious about like what feels good in your body is radical in and of itself. It is imaginative in and of itself. It is like, I think that that's a really great point. Thank you. Is there another hand or no?
I don't think there's another hand currently raised.
All right, we can move on. So as a sex therapist, a lot of my work is decolonizing shame, looking at shame, de-shaming, and it is such a huge part of the way that a lot of people relate to themselves, their bodies, their identities, and their sexuality. And so I would like you all to maybe think about a time where you had a first experience with shame. You don't have to share it, but maybe even if you just spent a moment thinking about it, what might you notice come up in your body when you think about that time, when you think about that experience? Maybe what sensations do you notice? How are you feeling? Do you feel like you don't want to think about this? Are you having a hard time thinking about it? So maybe rather than sharing what the experience was, maybe you can talk about a little bit about kind of what's happening for you in this moment as you try to think about it. I know for me, when I was thinking about shame, I was thinking about just like how it feels to not want to think about those moments and to pretend like they didn't happen, or to be like, I've done so much work to not live in those shameful experiences and moments. So I don't want to think about it. So I feel even in this moment, even in asking this question, of a little bit of apprehension, a little bit of tension coming up in my stomach. Know if that's coming up from anybody.
I'll help out again. That it's part of getting old is probably didn't feel shame at the time, but as I've grown and developed and learned and become a different person, I look back at probably a lot of things I should be ashamed of, or feel regret or shame now over the way I used to be in my past, especially as a young person. Like, there's so much that you don't know to think about or feel bad about or consider as something you should until the future happens and readjusts.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's really insightful also for you to have that perspective of maybe when you did something that you feel shame about, like being a perpetuator of of doing something that could have been hurtful to somebody else, and like having this distance from it and feeling something about it, of feeling that shame, and of feeling badly about how you maybe interacted with people when you before you knew what you know.
I read something once, I don't know where I read it, but this is not original to me, but that guilt is sort of that like feeling bad about the thing that we did that was maybe not right. And shame is feeling bad about who we are as a person. And so when I think of shame, I think about like if I'm being, kind of like vulnerable, like I very much grew up in the purity culture movement.
Sure.
And how we were sort of made to feel bad about ourselves and our natural sexual instincts, so our natural, that very natural sexuality that we had, that we all have as humans. And then I think I can now, as an adult, I can separate that from feeling guilty or kind of like the ick about less than great experiences, or how like an individual circumstance may have unfolded, versus feeling bad about who I am as a person just because I am a sexual being. And especially, I mean, I'm sure like anyone who identifies as a woman really can understand that too, as like that very unique experience of like, we're sexual, but we can't be too sexual, but we have to, it's all the things.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's such a great point of like, and to the next bullet point of like shame being a tenant of oppression, is who shame really serves. Of like, if you feel ashamed of your sexuality as a woman, then it really serves to maintain patriarchy. It really serves for you to feel small and quiet and vulnerable. Like, I think being vulnerable is a really big part of it too. Right. And I think that when you think about like homophobia, transphobia, it's really rooted in the idea that the very existence of queer people and trans people is unnatural and inhuman. So it really reinforces heteronormativity is the way to be. I mean, when we think about Black identity and Black sexuality, fetishization, it really is like, this is where you should belong. And it upholds white supremacy when you do feel shame, or when you do feel like you need to be a caricature of sexuality, right? So there's all of these different ways where it's like, if you are blank, then you behave blank. And it doesn't allow for that kind of creativity and imagination that we spoke to. And it makes you feel silent and weak and vulnerable and really isolate you. Because then, if you are if you are a Black person and you don't feel hypersexual, then you feel alone or you feel like there's something wrong with you. Leads you to go more internal, makes you feel less connected to your community, and it makes you less of a threat. Right. So when we feel like our experiences are being validated by members of our community or outside of our community, then we feel stronger in our conviction and stronger in our sense of self. And if we feel alone, then we feel fractured and we're less of a threat to like these dominant structures. And I think then, we think about like the violence and hatred that results from living lives that challenge shame. So when we think about the Pride movement and we think about what happened there, and we think about police brutality, and we think about white rage, I think is a really big part of it, of the feeling that a lot of that white supremacy maintains, of like this feeling of being threatened and feeling so angry, and then lashing out in these really violent ways that we see, on January 6th, that we see really every day. I'm sure people have lots of lived experiences where their personal or physical safety was threatened by virtue of their identity. So shame is really big. It's a really big part of, I think, understanding shame so that we can then access pleasure, which we're going to get to. And then I also wanted to, and I think to your point, Christina, that is kind of how guilt and shame are differentiated. If guilt is feeling badly about something that you did, and shame feeling badly about who you are, and how that is so isolating, especially like to your point about the purity culture and what it makes you feel. But like, I am bad if like if I'm deflowered, if I am no longer a pure virgin, and the concept of virginity being antiquated and problematic. But we also see like shame is like we think about shame being a motivator, especially like if we think about, if I am to shame myself into change, like that will be sustaining. Like I really think about like in the new year and New Year's resolutions of like, oh my gosh, I was so bad over the holiday season. I did all of these wrong things. I was taking time off work. I was eating foods that felt good. I was sleeping in more. Now I have to make up for that. I'm going to set my alarm at 5 a.m. I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. every day. I'm going to restrict my eating. I'm going to restrict like the time that I spend with friends, because then I might be tempted to do the things that I like. We really go like, we have the pendulum swing so far in the other way, and it burns out so quickly. So that's why we see like these things happen where it's like, okay, my New Year's resolutions are to like really restrict everything so much because I feel shame for how I behaved during these winter months when I'm supposed to be being, when I'm supposed to be resting, when I'm supposed to be connected, when I'm supposed to be taking it easy on myself. And, I think that there's like indigenous calendars that have the new year actually starting in spring. So if you think about it, it makes a lot more sense. It's the expectation to have a changed life when I'm in LA, so it's not really cold here, but for a lot of people, very cold, very dark still. It's, it makes no sense. So try and take it easy on yourself this New Year season. I've got lots to get through, so let me hurry up. So, in terms of comprehensive sex ed, which all of you are familiar with, I just have a little bit about kind of what we're taught and then what we miss. These are all things that I'm sure you all are familiar about. Heteronormativity, patriarchy, shame, racism, ableism, purity culture, compulsory monogamy, penetration and procreation, fat phobia. So these are all the things that we're taught. Racism is this dehumanization and hypersexualization of Black bodies in particular, and kind of like spills out to other BIPOC peoples. And it feels like, or what has been taught is the utility of the Black body for production rather than humanity. So even like Black penises or Black wet nurses and what they can provide to white folks and white people. So we think about like what that does in terms of sex education, how that informs Black sexuality throughout the decades. When you think about patriarchy, we think about the entitlement to the bodies of women and femmes, and then also the lack of creativity then that women and femmes get to experience around their own sexuality and sexual gratification. I think also capitalism, right? Like everything is constructed through the lens of capitalism. So we take pride in being busy, we take pride in being restrictive, and we shouldn't take time to explore what we enjoy, to be creative about what we enjoy. And sex should be a means of production, even. Like if we think about like sex being only for procreation, when you think about a capitalistic or hyper-religious lens, right? So what we miss are all the things that we really love, which is consent, pleasure, intimacy, creativity, curiosity, self-attunement, exploration, play, and communication. I'm wondering what I missed in either list that might be coming up for folks. Okay, I can move on. Oh,
I just wanted to say, I think we're also missing when we talk about pleasurement and we talk about self-attunement, we're not also talking about trauma survivors and how hard it might be for people to be embodied when it comes to sex and pleasure and connection with body.
absolutely. I think that that's a really great point also to think about ableism, right? Of like this ask to be embodied and how challenging it is for trauma survivors or from folks that might have different ability levels. And I think that it's really important to be able to include a very like diverse description of pleasure and of self-attunement and of what feels available to you. And so when we're not creative, we're just like, okay, be embodied means feeling pleasure in your genitals or being able to breathe deeply from your diaphragm. Some of these things aren't available to people. Some people experience a lot of pelvic floor pain. So I think that there's a lot of room for us to be growing and being different there. So when we think about sex and intimacy, to someone's earlier point about the orgasm gap and like how sex might not include orgasm at all, 100% agree with that. So I have these two lists of like sex might include making out, oral stimulation, masturbation, penetration, hand stimulation, nipple play, humping, massage, and intimacy might include napping together, sleeping together, making out, intentional eye contact, sharing stories, cooking, fantasizing, daydreaming, massage, masturbation. So even in this list, it's kind of meant to be like, all of these things can kind of flip-flop and be in either list, but we're kind of taught to really separate sex and intimacy. And then sometimes I think that it feels really challenging to separate those two things out because some people might not be able to feel sexual without feeling intimate. And I think that there's really a lot of ways that we can be more creative about how we conceptualize these terms. And I think that, you know, developing a connection with your erotic self and your erotic desires and pleasures, it has to prioritize consent. And it has to prioritize like what's honestly feels good for you or available for you in that moment. Consent also lives really in opposition to oppression. Violations of consent take away safety and trust within yourself, right? So violations of consent, especially like when we're thinking about trauma survivors, what Chris just said, of how that takes away your feeling of safety, how that takes away your feeling of being able to be embodied or be able to connect with yourself or connect with your community even. So I think that, you know, getting curious about what brings you erotic pleasure provides opportunities for you to connect with your body, to feel good, and to also be able to know what maybe doesn't feel good. You know, a lot of us have maybe like a story of what sex should look like and what it should feel like. And, you know, you hook up with somebody and you're just like making out at the doorway, ripping each other's clothes off, and then it's like you come together and then you rest together and all of that. But I think that it's this allows you to just really slow down and really think about like, maybe I don't want penetration at all today. Maybe I am not curious about penetration at all, period. Maybe it actually feels good to hold hands and watch a movie. And really just being like, and whatever sex is to me gets to be sex to me. I know I've worked with a lot of couples who there would be a lot of asexuality in the relationship and figuring out ways that there can be connectivity. And there's so many different ways to be connected when um when like typical or normative sex isn't included in the conversation. And I think that you'd be surprised about like how connected these couples or thruples can be when they're forced to be creative and forced to not lean on what the kind of like what our norms have told us about what sex is and what it has to include, So I think that those are some things to include or consider rather.
I also feel like I just wanted to say, like, as a sex educator, that by not talking about like these other things that are also intimate. So
Yeah.
like I think this is an area where even sex education sometimes doesn't get it right. Like we focus so much on the risk reduction piece of like preventing the pregnancy, the unplanned pregnancy, preventing the STI, preventing HIV, which are important things, that we don't like give them sort of like, here are some like alternative things that are still like intimate, that can still create a bond and a connection, that are not like, they're not sex. And not only are you giving them an alternate that is a risk reduction tool, but also it's like something that you're teaching them that hopefully they can carry into their whole, the rest of their lives, where it's not just about, because like, when I was coming up, that was all about like these forbidden things. And so then of course that's all they want to do, because it's forbidden and it's exciting. And versus like, here are these other like exciting things that can still make you feel tingly and special and connected. Yeah, so anyway, that's just an area where I feel like as sex educators we can always do better.
Yeah, and I think also there would be, when I work with couples and maybe there isn't sex happening in the relationship, and I ask them like, why is this so important for you to be having sex regularly? And a lot of them is like, well, that's what makes this not a friendship, right? So it's like, this is the thing that differentiates a romantic relationship from a friendship. But when we look at all of the different ways that you can create a really intimate romantic relationship that doesn't include sex, there are tons of things that you can do with your romantic partner that you might not do with friends, or how we privilege those things, how we privilege a sexual and romantic relationship over platonic soulmates, over relationships and of friendship relationships, over really important, that coworker that you absolutely love, and if they're not at work, you're freaking out. So I think that we like have these different ways to privilege and prioritize what types of relationships matter and what don't, and then what makes them matter and what doesn't. So I'll get into some examples of how to incorporate pleasure, and I'm going to be mindful of our time. So there are so many different ways to like incorporate pleasure into your life. So it's not just what is pleasurable from an erotic perspective, but just what can feel good, kind of like I mentioned earlier. So when I go to the next slide, it's just going to have some examples of pleasurable experiences, and I'd like you to just read them and maybe think about what else you would add.
I'm going to add reading. I don't think I see it, but that for me is like such a, like I only do that for pleasure now. Like I only do that because I want to learn about something, or because I want to like get lost in a fictional universe. I used to, because of so many years of like grad school and all that, it used to be like this thing I had to do and there was no pleasure in it.
Yeah.
But in the last couple of years, I've really gotten back into reading as pleasure, and like it almost like takes me back to when I was a little kid and I was just like this little bookworm.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like that would be one that I would add there too.
I can't believe I didn't add that because I recently just got back into reading for pleasure too, and I'm reading all these like fantasy romance books that are literally the only thing I think about. So yeah, same.
Yeah, yeah.
Anything else?
Creating art also.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely.
Someone in the chat said yoga,
Mm-hmm.
or like any, yeah, like joyful way that you can move your body.
Yep.
Paint. Somebody else said painting,
Mm-hmm.
looking at art,
Yeah.
dancing.
So many. And I feel like a few from this list, like doing nothing.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
You know, like when do we do absolutely nothing? And sometimes it's just like, even if you have to like schedule it, and you might notice that that guilt and shame come up when you do nothing, but really just being like, if I can reframe this into not laziness, but a way that I'm caring for myself, a way that I'm being, where I'm prioritizing my own pleasure and joy, like how different of a framing that is. And also like rest and restful experiences. I want to leave time for other questions, so I will move through this. So something that I do with people is developing a pleasure practice. So this is something that you can talk about with really anybody, but just like brainstorming different activities that bring you joy and pleasure, such as all of these and the things from the previous slide. And when you identify places in your day, week, or month where you can intentionally incorporate these activities, you begin to ritualize them and identify these behaviors as pleasurable. So it's not just doing nothing. It's not just creating art. It's not just reading. It's also being like, this feels good to me. And sometimes saying it out loud, even though that might sound silly, but really when we like authenticate it to ourselves, it does feel more like a ritual. It feels more like a gift to ourselves. It feels more like this is something that I'm doing to feel good. It's something that I feel good about. And kind of noticing like what your relationship is with even saying those things to yourself, with even saying those things to somebody of how quickly do you have to say, I'm reading, but it's don't worry, it's this type of book or it's that type of book, or and after it, I have to go to the grocery store, like, you know, kind of justifying and validating the things that we do. Or I took a nap, but only because I was up till 4 a.m. the other day. And then I got up for a 6 a.m. yoga class, of just being like, I'm doing this because I want to, and I feel good. I don't know if you all experience this, but I'm um, haven't lived with my parents in very, very long time. And still I'll be like, oh my gosh, who's going to get mad at me for doing something? Or who's going to make me get up from this nap? Like literally nobody. I live by myself. I can eat whatever food I want. I'm grown. And just like forgetting all of that conditioning and being like, I can just light this candle because I want to. I can just take a shower 3 times a day because I wanted to, because that felt good to me. You know, like these things are really important. And when you develop this pressure practice of like what it means to go against like this really oppressive capitalistic society that tells you that you can't and tells you that you need to justify it and make it make sense to other people. So that's why it's called a practice, because it is, I think, lifelong to incorporate this and integrate this into your life. But if you can identify those places, it helps your nervous system feel a bit more regulated because it's kind of grasping for these moments of pleasure and joy. So I wanted to just briefly go over some somatic connections, nervous system regulation. So these are just some things that you can do while having sex, while not having sex, but just incorporating the five senses, doing some somatic tracking, which could just be like, I'm noticing that I'm having some tension in my left shoulder. What would it be like to just identify what that feeling feels like? Like, oh, it's feeling throbbing or it's feeling pinching. And now I'm going to move back to focusing on maybe taking a couple of breaths. Now, when I go back to that part of my body, is it still feeling pinching? Is it still feeling throbbing? Maybe now it's feeling hot, like heat, and just kind of being curious about your body rather than changing it. Because a lot of times people feel like there's something happening in my body. I need to get rid of it. I need to change it. I need to make it okay. And a lot of times it can just be helpful to just be like, to just be curious and to not feel the pressure to have to change it or make it different. There's also intentional breathing, box breath, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, 4, 7, 8, same thing, but with different counts. Different types of grounding and like wiggling your fingers and toes, reminding yourself of the date of the week. If you have a commute to work that you take all the time, of paying attention to the street names and signs. I don't know about you, but when I was going into a physical office, I would just like arrive at work and be like, did I stop at any lights? I don't even know how I got here. So doing some things like that to just like have different types of awareness in your body. Speeding through. Okay, takeaways. So pleasure serves as an act of resistance because it rejects the principles of dominant and oppressive structures. Incorporating pleasure soothes the nervous system, which is often dysregulated due to trauma. And when your nervous system is more regulated, you're more able to reach out for community, for validation, safety, and acknowledgement. And so those are things that really help when you try to lead a more anti-oppressive life, when you're trying to connect with other community members who might be part of a group that has been oppressed by dominant society. So these are the ways that you can incorporate pleasure to feel more integrated and feel more present with yourself and your community. It's also anti everything bad is kind of how I think about it. It's like anti all the isms, all the pressures, all the shames. So that's another way to think about it in a fun little way. And that's it. I have just a few resources if you're interested. My podcast isn't on there, but yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Camille. This is so great. And I feel like just based on the conversation that for the things that people were offering, that they were also into it. And I think it's a really cool one to have in January when everybody outside is like telling us we need to, new year, new you, and we have to do all the things. It's kind of nice to like hear, no, we're allowed to just enjoy life and like enjoy ourselves and our bodies. I do have one question for you that is like maybe something that would be helpful for other folks that are on the call. How do we, as like thinking about sex educators, and I know you're in California, so it's probably a little different, but you probably can imagine in Alabama, deep South, the politics, not great.
Yeah.
That even just trying to do like traditional sex ed can be really hard. And so how might you incorporate some of this like language, like can we call it something other than pleasure? Just like I could see certain factions of people being like, oh, we're teaching, like God forbid we teach, that sex can be pleasurable, but you know what I mean? Like, is there other ways that we can be reaching our young people with the same kind of message in a more kid-friendly way, maybe?
Sure. That's a really great question. And I think also when we were on the slide about the definition of pleasure, and when you think about the word pleasure, a lot of people think about sexual pleasure, right? But I think a different way to think about it is play. When you think about play, then you kind of like, I feel like you can hide stuff in there.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's playful you could literally think about role play, but it's also playful to come up with like a yes, no, maybe list in terms of things that you're curious about. It's also playful to play like a game, like they have like different card games of like different types of like things that you might want to do with a partner or with friends, or like a never have I ever type of thing. So I think that when you think about like how to make it accessible in the Deep South where it maybe isn't, thinking about just like pleasure and play is kind of like interchangeable words, and just like what makes you feel good, I think is just a really important question that adolescents don't really get asked. It's like,
Yeah.
what do you want to be? How do you want to be better? What do you want to do in your future? Like, it's so, I feel like I was so anxious as a teen. I mean, still am, but like, because it's always just like, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do
Yeah.
next? And what's the next class? What's the next relationship? Where are you going to go to college? Like all of those things. So I think that when you're asking actually like what makes you feel good and what do you enjoy, and you can make it culturally relevant too. Like, what are some things that you and your friends like to do together that is more communal? Like, I think that sex ed, it doesn't have to talk literally about anatomy. It doesn't have to literally talk about, using a condom.
Yeah.
You can model consent through all of these ways of like, if you were into painting rocks, like how would you ask somebody to do that with you? Like different ways, I think, to engage and to model consent and pleasure, aka play, into your lives is just like getting folks familiar with that language. And then also languages around boundaries and being like, what wouldn't make you feel good, or how would you know when you were not having fun anymore?
Yeah.
And how would you say that to your friend, to your boyfriend, to your partner? So
Yeah.
those are also important conversations that is just skills based,
Yeah.
that is really transferable to sex, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. So just want to highlight that in the chat, Megan has dropped the feedback survey. If you will just take a moment to fill that out, that'd be super helpful for us. And then there was a question, Camille, about whether or not we would be able to get a copy of the slides. I know we are recording, and we'll send out the recording to everyone who's here. Are you comfortable with that, or?
Yeah, I guess what for?
Yeah, I don't maybe they wanted to share, but I don't know. I can't speak to why. I understand that you probably want to protect some of that intellectual property. So I am fine to just say like we can send out the recording. And
I can think about it and like give you probably like a PDF of the slides. Yeah.
okay, yeah, that would probably be perfectly fine. Yeah, so that is all the questions I see in the chat. Any final word?
Just thank you so much, everybody, for your listening and participation, and Happy New Year. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Happy New Year. Thank you, Camille. And thanks everyone for being here. We'll be in touch soon.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Megan.
Bye.